My name's Neil Hawkins, and I'm the chair of Humanists UK. I have the great pleasure this afternoon to introduce Professor Robin Dunbar. I've learnt so much about him in this little interlude that we've had. He has done stand-up. He is an historian of great note, and so on and so on. But what I have to tell you here is that he is Professor of Evolutionary Psychology at the University of Oxford. He's a Fellow of the British Academy of the Royal Anthropological Institute and an elected foreign member of the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters. He's been awarded the Osmond Hill Medal and the Huxley Medal. His popular science books include The Human Story, How Many Friends Does One Person Need?, Human Evolution, and most recently, and what we're hearing about today, How Religion Evolved and Why It Endures. And they have been translated into over a dozen languages. He is truly fascinating. Professor Dunbar.
Thank you very much, and welcome to my home city. I was born just up the road in Toxteth, and I still live up in this corner of the world. As you will have noticed, it is always sunny up here. It's a wonderful place. What more could you ask for? For all of you, other than the two non-theologians in the audience, I'm going to talk about why people are religious, which I think is definitely something which, as a humanist fraternity, we should all be interested in, because why is it that people are so intent on religion in this sense? So let me just give you a very brief history of religion. The general consensus has been for more than a century that religions began as essentially trance-based shamanic forms, what I call immersive religions, because every individual gets involved in it in some way. These are what the Victorians would have called animist religions, which kind of went out of favour as a term, but I think actually describes it very well, because it's a belief in a spirit world in which the spirit world is infused into everything around you. Trees, springs, mountains, whatever, all have a spirit associated with them in some way. These kind of religions have a very long history. They're still with us in the form of many hunter-gatherer societies. These are Kung San Bushmen from southern Africa, engaged in a trance dance, where the music and the dancing causes them to go into trance. Sometime around 8,000 years ago, just after the end of the last ice age, about the time people started living in villages, we see the first evidence for the rise of doctrinal religions. And this is associated with temples, ritual spaces of that kind, evidence for specialized priesthoods, and the like. And this essentially gives rise then a couple of thousand years later, during the period known as the Axial Age, between 3,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago approximately, to all the modern world religions. They all appear at the same time. What's interesting is almost all these doctrinal religions and the Axial Age religions appear in the same part of the world, this narrow band across the top of the tropics, on the northern side of the tropics, called the subtropical zone, the northern subtropical zone, all around the world, not just in the Middle East. Very similar kinds of religions arise. Okay, well, you'll recognize the top picture up there. The bottom picture may be less familiar to you. They are Zoroastrians, represented mostly today by Parsis, who are refugees from Islam into India and dominated. And I'm sure you all know many Parsis. And if you don't, here's possibly one that everybody knows. Yes, Farrokh Bulsar, better known as Freddie Mercury from Queen. Grew up a stone's throw away from where I grew up in East Africa. He was born in Zanzibar. Okay, what these nonetheless retained all these doctrinal religions, as they're generally known. They have sort of, the definition of doctrinal religions basically is they have theological doctrines, but also moral codes that are handed down in some way from above, whereas hunter-gatherers tend to have moral codes which are the product of the community. That's how we've always done these things. That's their justification usually, whereas obviously the doctrinal religions, particularly the axial age religions, say, no, there's a higher authority that's given us these laws which we must abide by. But nonetheless, what's really interesting, if you look closely, I mean, everybody who's interested in the history or the anthropology or whatever of religion focuses on the theology. And I think they completely miss the point of what these religions are about for their practitioners. If you look at the content of these religions, what you see underneath them is all these ancient, immersive, animist type beliefs. They're still there. It's quite extraordinary. These are whirling dervishes. You can go and see them even today in Turkey in particular, which is their sort of main area. They're a Sufi sect, much frowned upon by the other branches of Islam, where they use this whirling dance to go into trance. In the middle there, St. Teresa of Avila in Spain, a very famous Catholic saint, who was very prone to going into trance. And this is Bernini's statue of her in trance in Rome. So I'm going to ask three questions, essentially, for you. Why are people religious? And I think the message here is if you don't want them to be religious, you better understand why they're religious, right? Is religion actually good for you? And why are religions so fragmented? So the interesting question here is, why have we got so many religions? If religion was generically true, there should only be one religion. That's how things generally work in this world that we live in. But religions have this tendency, like languages, to fragment like crazy and produce lots of offshoots that eventually give rise to other religions. And that's the story, of course, of the Abrahamic religions, which are the ones we're by and large most familiar with here. They go back to Judaism, but Judaism was hugely influenced by Zoroastrianism, while the Hebrews were in exile in what's now Iraq, because the center of Zoroastrianism was Iran, modern Iran, Persia. Obviously, Christianity started as a sect of Judaism. In a sense, so did Islam. It drew heavily. That's why they use the Quran is basically the Old Testament with a few additions. And there were two other branches of the Abrahamic religions, one of which has now died, but were very successful, much, much more successful than Christianity in the Middle East. They went one of them went extinct, one of them is still just about with us. But anyway, the point is, it's this fragmentation process that's the issue. So why are people religious? I think basically it's that this mystical sense of religion that has such a deep history has never gone away. We still believe in things like foretelling the future. There's the famous Oracle of Delphi down there. But, I'm sure you're all going out of here to consult your horoscopes, see what's in store for you next week. Avoiding bad luck and the evil eye, widespread in Europe, particularly southern Europe, right into the 20th century, right into the second half probably of the 20th century. We're constantly praying for success in ventures. And if you don't believe me, go into the church somewhere. Tomorrow's Sunday, so you should. And just look on the inside of the door. There will be a prayer board there asking for your prayers for my well-being. I've got some illness and I need your prayers, or my children have got some illness. We still do it. It's still there. Looking for success in love, looking for curing illnesses, I said. And also, curiously enough, absolving the sins of the dead. We do worry about what's going to happen in the next world, even though we might not necessarily believe in it. But those who do. And here's a really curious little thing. When they were digging up the middle of Birmingham to make the new HS2 station there, they had to remove a very, very large Victorian graveyard, which was built for where it is a very poor part of Birmingham. It's where my mother's family come from, so I suspect there are actually many of them buried in that graveyard. And of course, knowing that it was a graveyard, it's been out of use since the end of the 19th century because it got filled up very, very quickly. When the archaeologists were brought in to take the bodies out, and they were going to be reburied somewhere else, obviously, what they found on about a dozen of the bodies was china plates on the breast of the person. And everybody was going, what on earth is going on here? You know, it's just grave goods, leaving things for use in the next life. And somebody remembered that over on the Welsh marches, right the way through the 19th century, and obviously before, there was a person known as the sin eater in every village, every parish. And the sin eater was called in, so you laid your dearly beloved's body out in the front room of your cottage, and just before the coffin was taken off to the church for burial, the sin eater was called in, and the sin eater ate what the contents of this. So what they'd done, is to put a plate on the chest of the body with salt and bread. And what was supposed to happen is the salt absorbed the sins of the dead person, put it into the bread. The sin eater came in, ate the bread, and took away the sins, and so helped the dead person get into heaven more quickly, presumably. And this is what these plates were doing. This is, was happening. It was very, very common in the Welsh marches. This tomb here is gravestone is the gravestone of the last known sin eater, a chap called Richard Munslow, who died in 1906. It's that recent. If you want to go and see it, it's in Rattlinghope Churchyard in Shropshire, St Margaret's Church. Lots of cultures in Europe, particularly southern Europe, do this. The Dutch had a custom of baking what they called in Dutch, so I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it, but in English it would be translated as dead cakes. And the family would sit and eat these cakes around the coffin to kind of absorb the sins of the person. Okay, so why are people religious in this sense? My pitch, if you like, is nobody ever joins a religion for theological reasons. It's not an intellectual exercise. It's an emotional one. You're either born into it or you had some kind of emotional conversion experience. And that's because the rituals engaged in religion, it really has little to do with the theory, if you like, the theology, has much more to do with the rituals that are engaged in religion that ramp you up and create this sense of belonging, and very powerfully so. Okay, so is religion good for you? You might hope not. Many people would say not. There is a view in the cognitive science of religion as a discipline which says actually religion is completely, in evolutionary terms, completely detrimental. People sacrifice themselves and they get no benefit from it. The answer is that turns out not to be true. These are data here from one of my survey studies where we're just asking people how often do you attend religious services? We don't care what kind of services there are. Our key marker is how often you go, how much you're involved in it. And what are you getting out of it? So, how do you feel about the congregation? How many friends do you feel you have? How trusting are you of the local community? It turns out that the more often you go to the religious thing, so it's not about your beliefs, it's about engagement and doing it. The more often you go, the more you feel engaged with your congregation, the other members of the congregation, the more friends you feel you have, and particularly people who are very, very actively religious, so sort of go daily, they feel that the whole congregation, normally, I'll put this in scale for you, all of us have a group of 5 what we call shoulders to cry on friends. So it's a little cluster in the center of your social world who are the people who are going to pick you up and put you back on your feet when your world falls apart. They will drop the baby to come and do it for you. It's that much of a commitment to you. Those sort of people tend to list the entire congregation of 80 people or 90 people as their friends because they feel so engaged with them. What's interesting is they're much more trusting of the local community that they live with. They're more engaged with their local community. They feel that life is more worthwhile. They feel much happier. And ironically for us, they tend to be less ill and they live longer. So you may change your mind about which particular church you belong to. Okay, but, and here is the big but in this story, and it goes back to the nature of sociality. We're not really geared to be social species, notwithstanding the fact that the primates, the zoological family to which we belong, is the most social species, intensely social group of species of any on the planet. And we're part of that, and we're intensely social in that state. But for mammals in particular, living in a group is extremely stressful. Don't you know it? It's full of this stuff. And the stresses come in two ways, and they do actually partition out by gender. There's just, well, not exclusively by gender, but typically by gender. There's the kind of internal stresses, which I like to refer to as the kind of stresses you get from being a London commuter, just people on the underground trampling all over you because there's no space. So you just kind of really tensed up. But of course, there's a lot of this other stuff that goes on. And primates have this problem. The whole of primate evolutionary history is about how to manage these kinds of stresses and hold the lid on them and prevent them destroying the social system. Because if you don't hold the lid on them, the society will break down and disperse. It's as simple as that. Primates do that by forming coalitions, and particularly the females forming grooming-based coalitions with each other. That just keeps everybody off their backs a little bit, well enough to allow them to live in groups. But here's the essence of the problem. This is the measure here is the outcome measure here is the proportion of all deaths that are due to homicide, to violence. These are hunter-gatherer societies, contemporary hunter-gatherer societies. So all these data are recent historical data. They date back people recounting their pedigrees and their family histories to anthropologists, for example, and sort of great-grandfather was killed in a squabble over something and that kind of thing. So they can piece together what the kind of rates of mortality are, as it were. So this is the proportion of deaths that are due to violence, and along the bottom here is the typical living group size. So it's the typical camp group size. And what I just want you to notice is how steep and tight. So each of these is a different hunter-gatherer society. And they're Amazonian Indians, North American Indians, Eskimos, people from Australia, peoples from Africa, and so on. So it's a good mix. Just how steep that is, and how tight. The bigger the group, the more stresses, the more squabbles, and it spills over into violence. What you're seeing here is the tip of the iceberg, as it were. But what it's telling us is why hunter-gatherers only live in camp group sizes of somewhere around 30 to 50 in size. And in fact, if you sort of extrapolated this rate up to here, 100%, it would suggest that if you are living in camp group sizes as small as 80 or 90, all your deaths would be due to homicide. And since most of the people who get killed in these kind of situations are younger, in kind of young reproductive age, as it were, it means no births, and therefore extinction for the group happens very quickly. Notwithstanding this, hunter-gatherers do not live their entire lives in these tiny, tiny groups. They live in a kind of dispersed form of social system which is scattered over a wider area in several camp groups. So typically, those bigger groups, what we call clans or communities, local communities, something of that kind, some sort of term of that kind, they tend to number around about 150, give or take, a tiny bit. But if all those 150 people were in one place, trouble. So what they do is they split the community up and live in sort of 3 or 4 smaller groupings, all within the same territory. And then if you get fed up with the Smiths, sorry if there are any Smiths present, you can go off and live with the Joneses in the next camp group, and it kind of, everything, it simmers down and it is much better for you. Okay. So the question is, that was fine until people started living in villages in the beginning, just at the end of the last ice age, 8,000 years ago or thereabouts. Very quickly, the size of these villages increased dramatically. How did we cope with that? Something must have happened to allow us to cope with that. This is how we think they probably did manage it. Basically, they're introducing a series of social institutions of a kind which allow them to diffuse in one way or another the stresses and tensions that arise when people are living together. Now, some of them are actual social institutions. So the form we can show with hunter-gatherer societies and small-scale horticultural societies, that men's clubs, for example, where they can just make these guys sit down and talk to each other over a peace pipe and sort their differences out, become very, very important. But generically, it's these things here. And these underpin, to this day, our social bonding amongst ourselves, our friends, but also at a community level. And it starts really with laughter, something we share with the great apes, which is why we think that's probably the earliest one, moves in probably about 500,000 years ago into singing without words. It's this pre-language evolution, and dancing. And finally, with the appearance of our species and fully modern languages, religious rituals, feasting, eating, and you'll be glad to know drinking alcohol together, though that probably comes in later, and storytelling, and particularly tragedies, the telling of stories, tragic stories. Now, we know for all of these, because we've done the research, that all of them trigger the endorphin system in the brain. The endorphin system in the brain is part of the brain's pain management system. So the word endorphins is a contraction of endogenous morphine, because chemically they're very, very similar to morphine, which explains why people get addicted to opiates. But the difference between those kind of street opiates and or prescribed opiates and the endogenous form, the endorphins, is a tiny, tiny little chemical difference in the molecular structure, which means you don't get addicted to it. You can get addicted psychologically. You like the experience and you come back for more, but you don't get addicted physiologically, so it's not destructive. So I keep telling our students, why do you want to take all these weird drugs? Just go in the library and work hard, and it'll give you the same kick. They don't believe me. Okay, but why endorphins are important is they're the basis of social bonding in primates. And they do it through grooming each other. So all that time that primates spend grooming, they're moving the fur, and it's triggering the endorphin system in the brain via a very specialized neural system, which we still have. This is why we do a lot of cuddling and hugging and patting on the back and stroking and all these kind of things. It just litters our conversations with the people that, are our friends and family, as it were. But that's its problem. It's very intimate, and therefore there's a limit on the extent to which you want to do it with larger groups. And also it's very time-consuming. So to bond a bigger group than monkeys and apes would bond, you need somehow to be able to step back and get rid of the physical contact component and to be able to trigger the endorphin system virtually. And that's what all these turn out to do. All of them, we've shown, trigger the endorphin system and increase, and we've shown with neuroimaging and stuff that it is actually endorphins that are involved, but they also increase the sense of bonding. So just to put it in this particularly religious context, because I know you're all desperate to know about what you're missing by not being religious, we did a study with my collaborators here at Coventry University looking at whether endorphin is triggered by religious rituals, attending religious services, and if so, whether it increases the sense of bonding to the group of people you're with. And it's very important to remember the increased sense of bonding is to the people who are actually there on the day at the time, not to the wider people. If your best friends are not there, you won't feel any more bonded to them. But if strangers are there, you will feel bonded to them. And we did it on, well, a bunch of sort of standard Christian denominations. We actually did it on some Islamic mosques, but we didn't have a big enough sample in the end before lockdown hit us, basically. We did it on a bunch. These guys, the Sunday Assembly people, I don't know if you've come across Sunday Assembly. It was started as a movement to replace Anglican Sunday services, basically. The pleasure of going to Evensong that the original founders had missed since they were children, although they were now atheists. A couple of comedians, actually, originally. And they just one day said, I just miss those kind of social events provided by the singing and hymns and all this kind of stuff. And they said, well, why don't we do a secular religion? This is it, Sunday Assembly. It mostly appears in the Anglophone world, but it's sort of modestly popular, not a huge number of people. And then we went out to Brazil and did it on these people, the Umbanda religion, which is a Afro-Caribbean syncretic religion, which is kind of one of the many ones, but an extremely popular one in Brazil. It's based on trance. Here's a medium going into trance here. It involves lots of loud music and dancing and stuff. And the mediums will go into to trance in some form. And you can see this is very, very modern, because women are the priests as often as the men are the priests. In fact, it's the reverse. In hunter-gatherers, it's the men that do the dancing, the women provide the music by sitting around singing and clapping. Here, the men provide the music, and you might see them at the back, and the women are the priests, as it were. And then this lady here, who's a yoga person, Hindu yoga person from Reading, the Swami Ambikananda, ran a series of yoga classes for us, half of which were given by her all the grand, if you like, religious theory, philosophy of what it's all about, and the other half were just given exactly the same exercises, but the story they were told was simply, these are the physical things you'll experience, and this is why you'll experience them in physical terms. Okay, so first of all, I should go back, sorry, and just say all of those, never mind, doesn't want to go back. Oh, God, now I'm in trouble. All of those trigger very nicely, oh, no. Oh, that's better. All of those trigger very nicely the endorphin system and the sense of social bonding. All of them, we showed it for all of them. Okay. Doctrinal religions have this capacity to somehow allow much bigger groups. And we think this is the reason why they came into place during the Neolithic, to allow bigger groups. So this is analysis I did with Rich Sosis, an American anthropologist, on using data on American 19th century utopian cults, or communes, really. Lots of these arose during that period. You know some of them, the Shakers, the Mormons, all these kind of people, the Hutterites. Very often they started as very small cults, going out into live in the Midwest, away from the sins and wickedness of society on the east coast of America. And they were going to live a much more pure life. Now, some of these were religiously framed, had a religious component to them. Think of the Shakers, think of the Mormons, and so on. But a number of them were secular. And these were mostly Owenite. So this is referencing back to Robert Owen, who founded New Lanark up in Scotland. And if you haven't visited New Lanark, you should do. He was interested in creating, many have argued he was the first serious socialist, if you like. He wanted to found a non-religious community which created this sense of community and allowed everybody to live a more equal life. And he eventually went off to America because he was fed up with the bureaucracy in Britain. Bureaucracy? There are worse places for that. But anyway, he found it too heavy here and went off to America because they didn't have any bureaucracy there at all, clearly, and founded lots of places. Now, he founded a community called New Harmony in Nebraska, which nobody's ever heard of because it only lasted 2 years. And this is the key to it. If you look at the histories of these things, what you find is two things. First of all, the religious communities were much bigger at foundation. They averaged about 150 in size. The secular communities were much smaller. They averaged only about 50 people. But secondarily, the religious communities lasted something like 7 times longer than the religious ones. And the religious communities last about 7 times longer than the secular ones. Secular communities last about 10 years on average. Robert Owen's New Harmony community lasted only 2 years before it was disbanded. The reason, usually in most of these cases, is because the commune founder runs off with the commune's money and some of the wives. Very, very common. What the religious component seems to do is impose a discipline, a communal discipline on the members, which stops them, just holds down the stresses and tensions that might otherwise arise. The other interesting observation I might make, which I'm sure you will want to implement, is that all these communities, irrespective of religious or not, the ones that lasted longest were the ones that prohibited most things. No tobacco, no money, no swearing. And best of all, the ones that lasted longest had no sex. Right? So there was no, and I think the reason for that is there was no children. Right? So families or couples weren't torn between commitment to their children and commitment to the community as a whole. Because you side with your children. If the children fall out or do something stupid, you side with your children inevitably, or your dogs, if you have dogs, against the other community. The problem for them was that then the community doesn't grow, right? Because you've not got a steady stream of people being born into it. Okay, so those things are clearly, there's something odd about religion, is I think the best way of explaining it, that allows things to work properly. And the question is, how does it do it? Well, I think there's probably 2 ways. One is what's known as the policeman in the sky phenomenon, right? So, there we are in our little commune here in Mountford Hall, and I can say to you, you may think we don't know what you get up to behind the bicycle sheds on Saturday night, but believe you me, there is somebody who does. Right? And that causes you to behave much better. It's as simple as that. But that's kind of like top-down policemen. Now, everybody knows that top-down policing actually only is not a very good, it's a sticking plaster and doesn't work very well. Otherwise, we'd all be driving at 69 miles an hour on the motorway. Right? And we don't. This is what really makes them work. It's this kind of mystical effervescence, to use Durkheim's term, that occurs in the context of religious services and religious rituals. So the question is there an optimal size then for a community, for community bonding, particularly religious ones? So the answer is yes. 150 is the number you need to know. That's the typical number of friends and extended family members you have on average, the average number of people, the number of relationships you can keep going at any one time. These are telephone call data, so it's analysis of an enormous cell phone data set from a very large European country, which is not the UK anymore. So we're not looking at your phones. Anyway, we don't know what you're talking about. All we know is who you called and if they're subscribers to the same thing. This is a massive data set. It's 6 billion phone calls over the course of a year, and it's 20% of an entire country's population for one mobile phone provider. And the yellow dots are the sort of scatter of these huge, whatever it is, 6 million people. The dotted line is just the curve fitted that. And you can see there's this very strong peak here at 150. So, yes, there are people like Neil here who know huge numbers of people and spend all their lives on their phones phoning their friends, and there are Billy no-mates like me down here. Nobody wants to talk to. But what's interesting is this number keeps coming up all over the place. It turns out to be about the typical size of number of guests at weddings, both here and in the US. It's very much the typical size of hunter-gatherer clans. It's the average size of villages in the Doomsday Book, as they've been worked out by the historians, where they counted everything except people, of course, because you couldn't tax them, or the Normans couldn't tax them. But the historians have worked out what the average village size is. It turns out to be almost exactly 150, but it's a very nice 600-year data set from the Italian Alps of grazing associations, essentially villages, which produce exactly the same average size. It just, over 600 years, it doesn't bat an eyelid, and that's because they're founding new villages elsewhere. So that's very, very common. That number 150 is known as Dunbar's number. You'll be very privileged to know that there are only, I think, another 9 people that have, scientists anyway, that have numbers named after them. All 9 are dead, so you're lucky to see me. And I just have to show you this, because somebody sent me a screenshot of Monday's, this last Monday's New York Times crossword puzzle. Right, this was on Wednesday, and I ask you just to look at the clue for one across. The first one, somebody's number, cognitive limit to how many relationships a person can maintain. The answer is Dunbar. It's me. Outreach in science doesn't come any better. Anyway. We did, as I mentioned, a study of a church congregation, but the average size of church congregations turned out, and the churches know this, particularly the evangelical churches, about 150 is the average size. If it's below 100, it will lose members because it's too much work for the people involved. If it's over about 200, it will lose members because people feel they're left out, and it's being taken over by a little clique in the center and running the whole thing from an office in London. Whereas if you get it right in the middle, it works perfectly. Everybody feels engaged and belonging. And the only way you can manage that is, as your congregation grows, is to keep splitting it. So this leads to church planting, the whole story of church planting. Okay, and here are our data really just showing these effects. So this is a comparison of the bonding index, just how important you feel that you bonded as a result of being involved in a particular church service or a particular ritual. So we're doing it through using pain thresholds as a proxy for endorphin production. So that because endorphins are part of the pain system, it's a very easy way of measuring them. And you can see before the ritual, these are your levels of pain threshold. After the ritual, so it's immediately after the service, you can see they've increased. These are a bunch of largely Protestant, Anglican, and the like, Catholic, I think, churches. I don't think the evangelicals are terribly enthusiastic about being involved for some reason. I can't remember now. And these are the Sunday Assembly people. You will notice that bad luck again is the religious folks start from a higher level. That's why, in all this happy, clappy places, everybody's smiling all the time. This is what the Humanist Association needs, is a kind of get-together, and everybody be kind of engaged and happy, and the world would be a wonderful place to live. And again, these are our experiments to show that it really is endorphins. So we're giving them naltrexone, which is an endorphin blocker, which is now used if you've been to alcoholics clinics, both of you. What they will often give you is an endorphin blocker, naltrexone or one of those, so that the endorphins triggered by the alcohol don't get picked up by the brain in the receptors and give you the pleasurable side of it. So that's what we're effectively doing. So these are the Umbanda people and the yoga groups combined. This is what happens with those who are given a placebo. They're just given a sugar tablet, basically. You see this increase, much as you see over here, but these are the people getting naltrexone. You can see their pain thresholds are dropping dramatically afterwards. Okay, last question. Why do religions fragment so much and so easily? I think it's due to this mystical spiritual component of religions. The doctrinal religions did not replace this. They merely added a philosophical or theological layer on top, which gave the religion more power, if you like, for top-down discipline, but didn't replace the basic mechanism from bottom up. And as a result, all these world religions as we have them now are constantly troubled by cults and sects bubbling up from underneath. They're almost always associated with charismatic leaders. They're always small. They always involve trance states. Just to give you two examples, the Baptists and the Methodists both started in the 18th century as charismatic cults. That's why and also, of course, the, what are they called? Gosh, I can't think of their name now. No, Quakers, thank you. Good man. That's where the name Quaker came from for them, which they bear proudly now. But it was originally, if you like, a derogatory term because of their going into trance and shaking, quaking. All of them started like that and gradually sort of were sort of, if you like, regularized in terms of their theology. Have I dropped this? Okay. Okay. What? Oh, sorry. The answer is I'm here to start again. Let me just quickly whiz through. How was that? Was it not going to go? Oh, it's there. Okay, sorry. Technology. It's desperate. Okay, so the problem with these things is, for the hierarchy, is they're extremely difficult to control, and that's why they don't like them and try to suppress them all the time. And you can see this in the literature. And I'll just give you one example. This is St. Therese of Lisieux. She's the second most popular saint in the Catholic Church after St. Francis of Assisi. She died when she was 24. She was a nun in France. The family is very interesting because they're the only family in the whole of the world ever where both parents are also saints. They were both canonized, as well as one of their daughters, the younger daughter, I think she was. So important is she that she's one of only 37 doctors of the Catholic Church. She was made, this is sort of icon figures who are very, very influential. Extraordinary, and the youngest one of them all. I think there are only 8 women out of the 37, but she is the youngest of the whole lot. Extraordinary. But she wrote this iconic book, The Story of a Soul, which is quite interesting to read, but just to illustrate how much this is all about this sense of belonging and so on, which is tipping very, very close to romantic relationships. Here's what she actually says. How lovely it was, that first kiss of Jesus in my heart. It was truly a kiss of love. I knew that I was loved, and I said, I love you, and I give myself to you forever. Ah, love, my radiant beacon light, I know the way to reach you now, and I have found the hidden secret of making all your flames my own. This is very, very typical of Christian mystics. And it appears in Islam, in the Sufi tradition, with the Qawwali tradition of singing the wonderful, wonderful stuff in terms of music that you get in sort of Pakistan and Afghanistan and Persia. But also in the Jewish tradition, in the Kabbalah, mystical branch of Judaism. And it's there in the Bible, in the Song of Solomon. That is not a religious text. It's a romantic text. These are romantic sounds. Very often Qawwali singing very often uses beautiful romantic poems as their base, and the singing gets you into trance. It's wonderful stuff to listen to. Okay, so here they are. The problem with cults is they usually involve some dodgy person, the Bhagwan of the famous Rajneesh Puram in Oregon fame. I do love this one because I just like the name of it. This is Brother Twelfth, who has some very ordinary name like Jim Smith, who set up a religious commune in Vancouver, in the hills above Vancouver, in the early part of the 1920s, I think. And a lot of them have behaved very badly and very dodgily. I mean, some of it's appalling. But it's all about hero worship. They are charismatic leaders. And what's interesting is it gives rise to, this is not my research, this comes out of anthropologists who worked on what they call proxemic desire, this desire to be near the guru, to eat his leftover food, to wear his cast-off clothes, to sleep where he slept, and very often to sleep with him. Right? It's this sense of romantic, almost bordering on romantic commitment. So I don't know if Andrew Copson wants to rethink the structure. No, we won't go there. But I just want to end by giving you two examples of these kind of weird and wacky cults. One is very old. It's Tanchelm of Antwerp, who lived about 1,000 years ago. As you can see, he became hugely famous as an itinerant preacher in northern France and the Low Countries. In fact, actually, he prefigured many of the objections voiced by Luther 500 years later. He was railing against all the kinds of abuses and so on in the Catholic Church even 1,000 years ago. But he kind of went off the rails, all his acclaim. I mean, it's hugely, hugely popular, and maybe that just caused him to go off the rails, as it were. But eventually he declared himself to be God. And to make it worse, he decided he was going to marry the Virgin Mary. Well, it's getting surreal. So he actually had a wedding for him and her in a field outside Paris, and it's alleged that 10,000 people turned up to this. Now, I'm sorry to have to tell you that the young lady concerned jilted him on the day. But anyway, she sent along a statue to substitute in her place. They literally got married to a statue, and perhaps not surprisingly, he was killed by a priest later. I mean, the authorities really struggled to do anything with him. And this is a more recent example. This is Mabel Baltrup, who founded the Panacea Society. Now, she was the widow of, the very impoverished widow of an Anglican priest in the turn of the, whatever it would be, the 20th century, the early 1900s. She'd had several bouts of major depression and been confined to an asylum on at least 2 occasions because of this. Her husband died. He couldn't get a job as a priest anyway. He couldn't find a living. And she was she knew this was something dreadful was going to happen. But as a result of these stresses, because this is what seems to produce them, she had this vision that she was the incarnation, essentially, of a very famous 18th century rural prophetess, Joanna Southcott. And she set up, on the basis of this commune in Bedford, which she came to believe was the original site of the Garden of Eden. She had 12 women apostles whose feet she ritually washed every week. And she was, it's kind of interesting theologically because Joanna Southcott herself created, although she had a very wide following, it was very much a kind of what you would think of today as a feminist philosophy. One of the things that Mabel Baltrup was pitching against was the male domination of the Church of England. And so she became the priest for the commune. I have no idea what the bishop thought of it, but given that the Church of England tolerates anything, quite literally, theologically, they probably just went, oh, okay. But she attracted a number of people. Most of her women adherents were, and they got up to be about 70. It's quite a big community at its height in the 1930s, about the time she died. A lot of them were the widows of Anglican priests. Most of them were very religious people and been involved in the church in some form or another. Eventually, they opened it up to men, and that was a serious mistake, because what that prompted was caused people to fall in love with each other. And they had to be banished. So, you know, if they fell in love with each other and wanted to get married, they were banished from the community forever. But this was hugely, hugely popular. And they had something like, I think it was about 10,000 external members all around the world. But it died out. I mean, it was very, very weird. They used to have, she and her little coterie that ran it in the center had sessions every afternoon of magical writing, as it were, with the Almighty. And then they would rush these letters into the 5 o'clock service every day to tell the rest of the community what was the messages coming down from the Almighty. But it got more surreal than that, because she decided that the Trinity should be 4 people, whatever that is, and she rechristened them. So there's obviously God the Father, that the Holy Ghost was, who was the Holy Ghost? God the Father, Jesus Christ was the Son, yes. There was the Holy Ghost, and she was the 4th corner of this quartet, and she was the divine daughter. So she elevated. This is extremely common for these kind of things, as they start to elevate themselves into being part of the Godhead itself, and it's creating this charismatic image. Usually, once they go this far, they don't really last, and you know, neither of these two survived the death of their founders. But those that do take off, because somehow they're able to sort of restrain the silliness of it, while at the same time creating this sense of belonging. So that's the puzzle, in a way, is how we kind of engineer something similar which creates this sense of belonging and community. You don't have to do it through religion, but religion clearly works unbelievably well to do it. So just to leave you with some thoughts, religion, it's a very late thing in our evolutionary history, and particularly modern religions as we have them. They evolved, and the ancestral kind of trance-based religions all evolved to bond communities of relatively large size, by primate standards anyway. The doctrinal religions evolved in the Neolithic to make it possible to live in large settled communities. And they're very, very prone to this effect of fragmentation. And it's because of this constant reversion in their members' psyche, if you like, to these ancestral states. It's very engaging. If you go into trance, it's absolutely extraordinary experience if you have these kind of visionary states. So as I said before, you know, it's no wonder all the kind of happy-clappy people look so happy, because they're doing lots of dancing and singing and stuff, all things to ramp up the endorphin effect and make you come out feeling a band of brothers and sisters, but also a happy band of brothers and sisters. So Neil is going to lead us in community singing. Thank you very much.